What happens when the director of Jaws hires the writers of television dramas Kojak and Starsky and Hutch and the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to make the ultimate modern haunted house movie? 1982's Poltergeist was, for years following its release, extremely popular among general moviegoers and the horror fanbase. Over time, after sequels, parodies, television spin-offs, and a poorly received remake, the film has receded into the shadows. Considering its initial splash, it's surprisingly rarely brought up in genre discussions. And yet, Poltergeist stands as a unique time capsule of a moment in horror's history, resting between the ultra-violent excesses of the 1970s and the camp of post-Nightmare on Elm Street 1980s. It may be the last popular horror movie that has direct lineage to the storytelling techniques of Hollywood's golden age, channeling such greats as The Haunting, The Innocents, and The Uninvited. Controversies about movie curses and who sat in the director's chair aside, Poltergeist is a film that deserves examination and discussion. You may not agree with everything I'm about to present, but hopefully it'll re-engage you with the film and reignite a conversation that really never should have ended. The movie opens with the United States national anthem blasting at full volume. A moment later, after Tobe Hooper's director credit and the title card, we are hit with extreme close-up patriotic images. We can vaguely make out what might have been the Lincoln Memorial in the Capitol building, before a slow zoom out reveals the statue of the raising of the flag over Iwo Jima. This opening goes strongly against expectations. The end of the television channel's broadcast day represented an end rather than a beginning to the viewers of the era. In a way, we begin with the idea of death, culminating in a screen flickering to static. But also, we are introduced to the idea that this is a film about contemporary America, a theme that will weave throughout the rest of the narrative. The camera pulls out further and we see Steve Freeling has fallen asleep on a rocking chair while watching television. That family name is important, by the way, Freeling. They're free. It's about America. This image, in a way, encapsulates what the entire film is about, an America lulled into profound sleep, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The family dog, Ebuz, licks at a bit of his spilled beer, setting up the first sequence's linking motif. We follow Ebuz out of the living room, up an oddly designed staircase, reminiscent of the spiral staircase from the namesake film and also The Haunting, and into the master bedroom, where Diane Freeling sleeps. Notice that the couple have fallen asleep separately. Also note that the first thing that we see inside the master bedroom is a second television set. It's not a stretch to think that they spent their evening in different rooms watching different shows. This is the first indication that this typical American family is suffering from typical dysfunctions. Nothing so cataclysmic as to suggest a divorce is imminent, not yet, but there's some static in the household. Ebuz searches the bedside table for food but comes up empty. Next, Ebuz visits the oldest daughter Dana's room and steals a bag of chips from under her pillow. The dog is introducing us to the family in the order of age, a clear indication of intentional storytelling. Dana's hidden potato chips suggest that the snack is a sort of contraband, smuggled into her room against her parents' wishes. In 2024, this probably seems incredibly old-fashioned, but back in 1983, parents had strict reviews of their children's diets. That a bag of Lay's brand potato chips was used and not a generic, or one created specifically for the production, is also important. This isn't a film about this family, it's about your family. This is a bag of chips that you've most definitely had in your house. The dog then enters Robbie and Carol Ann's shared bedroom. What does it suggest that they share a room? Perhaps Carol Ann was unplanned? This seems especially probable considering that Steve's job is in housing sales, and presumably they could have designed the house to suit their family needs. Ebuz visits Robbie first and quickly snatches a candy off his headboard. Then he trots over to Carol Ann, but after a moment of nuzzling her arm, he quickly abandons the search. The movies introduce the family without them doing anything but sleep. It's also slyly told us who the center of the story really is, Mother Diane and innocent Carol Ann, the two that didn't sneak food into bed or fall asleep in front of a television. The other family members, Steve, Dana, and Robbie, have already been seduced by television, junk food, and all the other modern noise that can distract us from a healthy family life. Hint, that's the ghosts, all that noise, all those distractions. But that's all about to change. Waking up, Carol Ann heads downstairs, seemingly transfixed by the flickering television set. She asks, "Hello, talk louder, I can't hear you." While the surface narrative would have it that she's hearing and attempting to talk to ghosts from within the television, the real story being told is a bit more chilling. Carol Ann is identifying with mass media for the first time. She's hearing voices from outside of her family. And why? Because while they were sleeping, other influences were able to reach her. The family awakens and surrounds her, but it's too late. An important part of her childhood innocence is already in jeopardy. What immediately follows has to be every parent's worst nightmare, as Carol Ann starts answering questions being asked by the voices that she hears emanating from the television, starting with her age, and then some questions that she can't even answer. She says she doesn't know. Stranger danger was certainly a big deal in the 80s, but this takes it to a whole new level, because on one side, the surface narrative is asking us to believe that ghosts are communicating with her, which is a scary idea. But what do ghosts really care about her age, or what other questions are being asked? We never hear them. We don't know. But a stranger on the street asking these same questions of Carol Ann takes on a much more sinister intention. We quickly cut from this disturbing scene to a hillside view of a planned community. There's calming music playing. All the houses are very pretty, but they're all the same. And that uniformity has a soullessness to it. Something's been lost when we started to build these planned communities. And of course, Stephen is part of that. He sells these houses, so he is incriminate in what is wrong with exactly this kind of community. And of course, communities are really just a plural version of family, right? A bunch of families live in an area, and we call that a community. So if there's something wrong with the community, it's really wrong in every household as well. And as we'll discover much later in this film, the sins of creating these kind of faceless, monolithic houses all in a row goes back very, very far in our culture and in our history. So after we get the montage of the town and a bit of light humor involving RC cars and a guy on a bike, we go into the Freeling house, and we discover that Steve has his friends over. They're drinking beer, watching the football game, and cheering and cursing loudly inside the house. We're going to return to them in a second. But first we are diverted to Diane, who's cleaning her daughter and son's bedroom and discovers that their pet parakeet, Tweety, has died. It's very telling that her initial reaction to this is, "Oh shit, couldn't you have waited to a school day?" She's not ready to deal with death. She's not ready to do the parenting thing. And that's important because it's very clear that much of her life has been defined for her instead of by her. She probably is not as comfortable with the role as mother as she would have liked to have been when she started out this journey. We can see this throughout the film. We also see it just in the behavior of her kids besides Carol Ann. Carol Ann, again, is presented always as an exception, as the innocent, as opposed to Dana and Robbie. Precocious would be the word for both of them at different ages. So meanwhile, we go back to the living room, and Steve and his friends are watching the game. They're shouting, they're using profanities and taking the Lord's name in vain, when suddenly the channel changes because they're getting interference from their next door neighbor's remote control, who is changing the channel to watch Mr. Rogers for his kid. Now, what's interesting is that we're actually kind of sympathetic to Steve in this moment. But if you think about it, who's right in this situation? I would say the needs of the kid that's not on the street playing with RC cars, tripping bicyclists, is probably the one in the right. And that Steve's wrong here. He's more concerned with hanging out with his buddies and drinking beer and being loud and obnoxious than spending time with his kids. Notably, his daughter is eating food out of the refrigerator, kind of unchecked. Neither parent are doing a stellar job right now. But Steve is right now not being the better man. He's setting a bad example for his kids. And Carol Ann walks in on Diane about to flush Tweety the bird down the toilet. This is not a dignified burial or way to say goodbye to a beloved family pet by any means. By the same rate, I don't think Diane is doing anything hostile or wrong necessarily. It's more ignorant, right? She still doesn't understand this parenting business. So to her, she was just trying to get away with it. I don't know what she was going to say. The bird got free and flew out the window, whatever. But she's not going to be honest with her kid. And the point is that Carol Ann is dealing with a loss of innocence again, literally hours after her first brush with it, with the voices on the television. And neither of her parents are really willing to deal with it or even try to make her understand it in any sort of real world way. It's made even a little bit more profound by the fact that Carol Ann is trying to deal with it, and in fact does a better job of parenting when she puts items into the cigar box that they're going to bury Tweety in for when he's hungry and when he's lonely and when it's nighttime. That's all how a proper parent takes care of their kid. Of course, what is Robbie doing this entire time when no one is watching him? He's dangerously climbing a tall tree outside the house. Okay, I can already hear someone in the comments saying, yeah, but in the 70s and 80s, we just climbed tall trees. That's what kids did. We're too overprotective today. And I agree, actually, with all of that. I would have climbed the tree, not a question. But I also got hurt climbing trees as a kid. So the point still stands. And if you know this movie, you know eventually what's going to happen with that tree, right? So what follows is a mock funeral for the parakeet. And Carol Ann recites the only prayer she knows, which is the Lord's Prayer. Meanwhile, the other two siblings, Dana and Robbie, are both kind of mocking it. They're not taking it seriously. They're being pretty heartless, in fact. And it just kind of goes to the fact that they've already been corrupted. They're not bad people. They're not bad kids. This isn't an exaggeration where they're going to be serial killers in the future. But they don't have that innocence that Carol Ann has. And while Diane is trying to do the right thing here, she's still kind of just stoic but empty. She does nothing really comforting. Again, Carol Ann is doing all the hard work here, while her brother is saying, let's dig the bones up, and her older sister is mocking the whole ceremony. So let's talk about the tree for a second, because there's always someone who thinks I'm looking too deep for things that aren't really there. And the tree is a great example of storytelling laid extremely bare. This is a planned community. There's no way this dead-ass tree is left standing when they're building the house. And if it died after the house was built, okay, fine. But in a planned community where they're still trying to sell houses, that tree comes down. So that tree is there for a specific plot reason, not any logic reason within the story. And take a quick glance around Robbie's bedroom when you watch the movie next time. You'll see that's filled with brand name merchandise aimed at kids. There's Star Wars, and there's a lot of Disney, which is ironic because now they're the same thing. Back then they weren't. He's reading a Captain America comic book. Considering that this is a movie about American families in the early 80s, that's not on the nose, right? And of course, Carol Ann is trying to be motherly. She's trying to feed the fish in the back. Of course, she's doing it wrong because, again, there's no parent observing her, so she's overfeeding the fish and probably going to kill them. But the tree is a representation for Robbie specifically of the lack of parenting that's going on in his house. Now, it's not a complete lack of parenting, okay? There's going to be those who think that these parents are doing a good job when they watch the movie. Maybe in 2024 that is a reasonable deduction, but in terms of 1982 parenting, these are not good parents. They're too concerned with themselves, they're not paying attention to their children, they're letting their children take dumb risks. Immediately after this, we get this kind of tender scene between Diane and the children, where she tucks them each into bed, and it's tempting to think that this is her good motherly side. And that's part of her character. Again, this is about her arc in becoming a better parent to a large degree, especially to Carol Ann, who desperately needs it and hasn't been corrupted. But look what follows. Stephen and Diane are smoking joints and watching Twilight Zone. And you have to ask yourself if that's really what a parent, especially a parent in 1982, was expected to do as a traditional role. The answer is no. As quickly as you get this glimpse, a good maternal instinct from Diane, it's immediately counteracted. Did I mention this film's about America? Okay, so I'm not saying that clowns aren't scary. But I am saying that there was certainly a time when clowns weren't thought of as scary, and they represent a form of child entertainment from a bygone and more innocent era. So I would find this little exchange between Robbie and the clown doll to be really fascinating. Not more so than the attack that comes in just a bit. Basically, Robbie can't get to sleep because he feels the clown is looking at him. So he gets up and throws a jacket over the clown doll so he doesn't have to see it. It doesn't make the clown doll go away. He just doesn't have to see it. But what's really interesting is he covers it with a jacket with Chewbacca on it. So what we have is this bygone era of children's entertainment being replaced by a modern one. And that modern one is far less innocent. I mean, the movie's called Star Wars, after all. Wars, right? Even if Star Wars is pretty innocuous entertainment, it was a recent thing to have as much violence in kids' movies. Especially considering that the most recent film to have come out was Empire Strikes Back, which is a pretty dark film. All the posters on the wall and the bed sheet on the bed are Empire Strikes Back. And just to cap this off, immediately following a very quick cut of the doll covered by the Chewbacca jacket, we get an even faster cut of the tree outside his bedroom door, as if the tree itself is watching as well. So what we're getting is a juxtaposition of the 1950s innocent kids entertainment being replaced by that kind of rough and tumble 70s, 80s kid entertainment, followed by, well, something truly terrifying just outside the window. It doesn't escape my notice either that there is an Alien poster on the wall in Robbie's room as well, which is a film that he really shouldn't have seen at this point. Okay, so we're approaching the sequence where the evil escapes from the television to directly enter the house and begin to interact with the family. I'm far from the first to point this out, but if you look at the time on the television, it's 2:37 a.m. That already is kind of suspicious, because in my experience, the television channel is always clocked out right at the end of a broadcast hour. So 37 would be very odd. But what this seems to be is a reference to Room 237 from The Shining, the film, not the novel. This could be just Hooper and Spielberg having a little bit of fun with a little in-joke, a little Easter egg. But it could also be a kind of subliminal to put you a little bit on edge. Many people would have seen The Shining recently when this film came out. It was only a couple years removed. It was hitting television about this time. It was very much in the zeitgeist. So maybe it was meant as a slight subliminal to put you a little bit on edge with what's to follow, which is, of course, the spectral hand coming out of the television, marking the wall behind the Freeling's bed. Which is an important moment, too, because, of course, it's the mother and father's bed, hypothetically where they conceived at least Carol Ann, that is being marked. In an earlier version of the screenplay, Diane was actually assaulted on this bed, and I do mean that in the worst possible way, by the spirits near the climax of the film. It kind of still exists in the final film, but it's really unclear what's happening. Ultimately, it looks more like she's just being tossed around the room and made to walk across the ceiling. In the original screenplay and in some of the surviving production art, you can clearly see that the intention was something much more graphic. I think at one point there was a consideration that the Poltergeist needed to be an R-rated film, and when that was rethought, that scene went away, which sort of neuters this sequence, but still effective to let you know the evil is inside the house. It's escaped from the television world. It just originally meant something even darker. It's kind of like the violence and sex of the entertainment landscape that was informing the culture of America at that time and affecting how people raised their kids had entered the household. In some ways, it's redundant to what we already saw with Carol Ann earlier, but I think that the big special effect allowed the surface plot to really take hold at that moment. So just a couple of really minor things about this breakfast scene. First thing is, this is the first time we've seen Carol Ann act up. It's just youthful tomfoolery with her brother and sister, but up to this point, we've seen her only be kind of purely angelic. But the evil's in the house, right? The voices from the static are here now. The culture has made its way into the house, and so, of course, she's acting up. And just to put a point on it, Diane asks her, hey, what did you mean last night when you said they're here? Besides, presumably, to give the poster a tagline. And Carol Ann says, the TV people. And that's meant to be taken a couple ways. I mean, she's saying that it's the people who came from the television, the ghosts, but it's also just literally the TV people. And of course, there's a television on even during breakfast. Carol Ann moves over to it after the glass breaks, and she watches static. I think that image is also very telling. She's literally looking to the television for guidance, for entertainment, for voices, for communication, for contact. And that was an entire generation of kids. The latchkey kids of America grew up watching television and eating cereal, right? Robbie's bent spoon is really played off almost as just a quick, quirky joke in this movie. And that's a little bit weird. But again, sugary breakfast cereals probably are doing some pretty horrific things to him. The physical representation of that here is something like a Uri Geller bent spoon, right? Okay, one of the tragedies of this movie, and it's a tragedy beyond the movie, of course, as well, but it's that the older sister, Dana, has the least to do. She's there really just as a thematic balance in a few scenes, but she doesn't really get many moments to herself. And here's her one moment. The construction workers who are digging the hole for the in-ground pool that the Freelings are putting in start to catcall her, and she makes an elaborate flipping off gesture towards them. It shows her like standing around, but also shows that a teenage girl in America at that time was really likely to face that kind of behavior. I don't think it's a big point in the movie, and sadly, if it was meant for something more, perhaps it was meant to be more along the lines of that exercise scene with Diane on the bed. It's kind of lost in the final film, and I think the scene was kept ultimately because of the tragedy that befell the actress. No one really wanted to cut any of her scenes. But I think there's an interesting possibility of where this movie could have gone had it chose to, with a more prominent role for Dana, the older sister. Haunting accounts, and I don't believe in any kind of spirituality at all. I don't believe in ghosts or demons or anything like that, but the spiritual accounts usually revolve around an adolescent girl. So her character would, on paper anyway, seem to be the more likely center of the story. As it is, though, she is the least featured character of all the mains. In fact, the parapsychologists that'll show up in a bit have far more development than she does, and that's a shame. Intersped with a little light comedy here, we have the aftermath of the breakfast scene. Diane is upset that her children don't push their chair back into the table after they leave it, and she's vocal about this. And then she tells Caroline that she shouldn't watch Static because it's going to destroy her eyes, and immediately turns on a war movie for her to watch instead. Now, again, it's played as a joke, but that's the theme of the movie, is the violence coming into the house through television and art and entertainment is not appropriate for kids, and parents are allowing it. I don't think there's a criticism necessarily of the entertainment existing as much as it's the parents allowing their children to consume it. But then Diane goes back and discovers the chairs have been pushed out again. Perhaps she thinks that Caroline is being precocious. She asks her if she did it. She says no. She goes to put away some cleaners under the sink, and when she comes back, the chairs are arranged in a very ornate fashion on top of the table, which would be impossible for Caroline to have done in the brief amount of time, or probably at all, since some of the legs of the chairs aren't even on the table. It's a great moment because it has that feeling of the truly uncanny. It's a great sleight of hand moment, completely practical effect. Now, something like this would be done digitally now, and we would immediately tell that it was fake, and our brains would process it as a trick. Here it really works because ultimately just a bunch of stagehands practice putting up chairs real fast, and it really works. But thematically, it's really hammering home that this is a film about the parents not knowing how to raise their kids. Because the ghosts, again, the noise, the culture, the war movie, is mocking the mother for not being able to get her kids to just push a chair back under a table. And I fully admit this next thing is probably a reach, but when I look at those chairs and the designs I'm seeing them form when locked together like that, it almost resembles a demon sigil out of the Lesser Key of Solomon. I don't know, what do you think? So a cool transition follows in which we see Steve at work with a potential buyer of one of the newly constructed houses. And it's a transition from the Freeling house to this new house, and they're identical. What's important about that is it's just showing how mundane this kind of model house, white picket fence, two-car garage existence really can be. And also that it loses sight of what's actually important. Every house should be as individual as the people who live inside of it, but that's not true in a development like this. So the tree's attack is not really remarkable, to be honest with you. It's great special effect. It's just really a representation of the family's attitudes towards protecting their kids to begin with. Robbie is all over the place about this tree. He climbs the tree, but then he says he's scared of the tree, which doesn't make much sense unless the tree represents danger, right? If, as a character, he would avoid the tree if he was honestly afraid of it, but he's not. He's afraid of it when the plot needs him to be. And that's what tells you it's a device. So the tree breaking into his bedroom and snatching him out the window is really just meant as a representation of his parents' neglect. Check out what happens when the closet door opens. The poster of Bert and Ernie is turned to face against the wall out of view, but Darth Vader remains staring straight into the room. He's front and center still. In fact, the light that's emanating from the closet seemed to illuminate him even more. It's hard not to see it as the more traditional form of entertainment, the wholesome entertainment, is being disregarded by what is coming out of the closet. And the light that's coming out of the closet is remarkably similar to the look of the television when it was illuminating those dark rooms early in the film, both when Steve fell asleep on the rocking chair and in the parents' bedroom. So right as Carol Ann is about to be abducted, we get this shot. It's a quick shot of her in her bed, but there's a detail about it that's really important and really speaks to what I've been discussing. Carol Ann is going to bed with the clown doll in her bed. This is very different from Robbie, who doesn't want to even have it across the room from him. And I think that's very much an illustration of just how innocent she is. Of course she doesn't see threat in the clown doll, where he does. It's very clear that the Sesame Street poster belongs to Carol Ann, and the Darth Vader poster belongs to Robbie. Okay, so this doesn't have anything to do with anything at all that I'm talking about, but this might be the only place I can ever kind of just vent my frustration. I hate this tornado. Okay, I don't think Poltergeist is a perfect film to begin with, but this sequence is by far the worst thing in it. The tree looks awful. The tornado looks terrible. It's a mess. If there's one set of shots I could take out of the film, it would be everything outside between Steve and the tree. It's just pretty incredibly poor. I don't know if they were trying to do some kind of Wizard of Oz thing here. Thematically, it really doesn't fit. It does seem kind of like that might have been part of the Spielberg influence, but it doesn't work, and I wish it was gone. Okay, fuck right off. I don't know how ghosts control tornadoes. I don't think that works at all. But the physics are like so wonky. It can lift up the tree, but it can't pull him off the ground. This is like Ripley holding on to a ladder in Aliens against the vacuum of space bullshit. So, no. I really like the sequence in Carol Ann's bedroom that occurs while the horrific, awful outdoor tornado scene is happening. Here, Carol Ann's entire room is being sucked into the closet. In a way, of course, that the tornado can't even lift people off the ground, but ghost light, or the television light, from inside the closet, like, just sucks everything, and it hoovers the entire room, including Carol Ann, through the air. You have to wonder if maybe that Carol Ann and the tree both ended up in the same place, right? I like this sequence because it really does take the idea of a lost child to extremes. Like, they lost her in a figurative sense when she started being influenced by, television and movies and what have you, seduced by Disney. But in another sense, they've lost her physically. And shortly they're going to start hearing her in the house. And I really love that concept, that they only start really listening to their daughter and doing the parenting thing when she's gone. Horror is not just about scaring you. It's about all the dark emotions. Regret is one of the strongest and least well-used dark emotions in the genre. There have been recent films that have done a good job with this territory, like The Dark and the Wicked. But really until the last 5 years or so, or at least since the arrival of A24's sensibilities, if not the actual A24 films, we weren't really getting those more complex, harder to reach emotions being explored deeply. There are exceptions. The Hanukkah Julia, which I consider to be the scariest film of all time, does really, really well with sorrow and grief and regret.
But there really wasn't much like that film when it came out, and that's the reason that the film didn't do well and didn't have much of a legacy until its few proponents started screaming loud enough. Today, there's been a lot more interest in that film. Poltergeist had the opposite effect. It came out as a huge release that was everywhere, and then over time, its influence seems to have whittled down. I think that has a lot to do with it being the last of its kind, though, because even the two sequels are not really structured like this film is. The second film is closer than the third, which the less said about the third, the better. But it's still a very different sort of film. The narrative is much more a reflection of where storytelling was in the 80s, whereas this film feels like it could really have been made without many changes in a much earlier era, maybe the 50s. So the family go around the house searching frantically for Carol Ann, who has disappeared. It's a really intense sequence, but it's intense mainly because of that Jerry Goldsmith score. Because if you're thinking about this rationally, the family just witnessed their son almost being eaten by a tree that just got sucked into the air by a tornado that didn't even hit any of their neighbors, just their house. One experience should definitely be more intense than the other. Now, I understand the earlier fake-out scare involving the clown doll in the closet. Yeah, certainly that's a scary thing for parents. But just searching for where she's hiding in the house because there was a tornado, that almost seems like the obvious thing a kid would do would be hide. Maybe she'd seen some scare films in kindergarten or something and was hiding under a strong archway. But the Jerry Goldsmith score really sells all this in a way that the filmmaker should be extremely thankful for, because honestly, I think the previous sequence doesn't work, and they need this sequence to really work because this is the linchpin of the rest of the movie. If Carol Ann's disappearance doesn't strike the audience as traumatic, the rest of the film doesn't work at all. So it's a good lesson that a great score can save your movie. Just ask John Carpenter with Halloween, or ask Stanley Kubrick with The Shining. Well, I guess you can't ask Kubrick anymore, but I'm sure he would have supported the idea. They eventually realize that they're hearing Carol Ann's voice coming from the television. I like this so much because what it reminds me of, even though I'm not a parent and will never be a parent, don't want to be a parent, is that many parents have the experience of their children watching a film or hearing a song that they probably shouldn't, a little bit too young, and then later the child uses some inappropriate language or imitates something from on screen. And the initial fear of the parent, of course, is that they're going to get found out that they let their kids listen or watch something inappropriate. And that's what's happening kind of here, is that now they are hearing Carol Ann speak from inside the television. Remember that they couldn't hear the voices that were speaking to Carol Ann in that earlier sequence, but they can hear her now. In other words, they paid for a bad babysitter in the television, and now they have to recognize it because it's screaming out their names and pointing directly at them. And this is punctuated by Diane putting her hand against the screen the same way Carol Ann did in the earlier sequence. Perfect bookend. In a way, if this was a short movie and meant to end on a downbeat, this would be a perfect place to shut off the film. But I'm glad it doesn't, because that puts the tornado too close to the climax, and who wants that? So I don't have much to say about the sequence in which Stephen goes to the local college to ask the parapsychologist to come help. The scene feels more like a parent going to a social worker, and I think that's actually really smart screenwriting because it feels really grounded. But then it's followed by something that's not grounded at all, and it's one of the weird tonal shifts in the film. Again, I don't want to get into who really made this film, because I have my thoughts on that, and I think there's good evidence for that, but I think that you had two very strong personalities in Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg, and at times they were very much in conflict, and sometimes they were in concert, and both brought kind of majestic visions. That pull and push is at sometimes pretty uneasy, and sometimes it's a beautiful concert. The sequence in which Stephen goes to show them Carol Ann and Robbie's bedroom is such a weird one for me, because it's filled with kind of Sam Raimi-esque nonsense. And I mean that in a positive way if it was in a Sam Raimi movie, right? I think if we look at something like Evil Dead 2, the silliness is part of that universe. But there's really nothing in Poltergeist up to this point to suggest anything this silly. It starts off early. Stephen is drinking a beer while he shows them into the house. I guess this is supposed to show that he's stressed, but I mean, it just comes off as a comic beat, especially as the one parapsychologist is describing how he recorded a Matchbox car traveling over 7 hours to go like across the linoleum floor. And he opens the door, and obviously the room's in disarray and things are flying around. There's not really much to say. It's meant as a joke. Again, there's a lot of humor in Poltergeist. For a film that for a long time was considered a very scary film, there's a ton of humor in this movie. The joke is fine. It doesn't really do much for the film, but it's fine. But there's a bunch of weird stuff like a record that emits sound without speakers attached to them just because a protractor is in the groove. The stuff like that is just kind of weird. But I want you to notice that while all the other child entertainment, even the stuff that's modern that might have been objectionable up to this point, has now been removed. It's all been eaten by the closet. See the one piece of wall art that the spirits left up? It's the one thing that the kids definitely shouldn't have seen. Because you can make a case that Star Wars is innocuous to a 7 or a 5-year-old. But you cannot make that argument about Alien. Now, I probably saw Alien about at 10. And that was probably still a little bit too young. But there's no way Robbie should have seen this film, let alone Carol Ann. But the fact that the Alien poster is still on the wall, to me, speaks volumes about the filmmaker's intentions. The television séance sequence is really a big exposition dump. But it's one that's done very cleverly and in an inoffensive way. And honestly, in this time period, this is pretty elegant. There was not yet a gut reaction to exposition on screen as being purely bad. So the fact that they ease in enough of this is really impressive. Communicating with Carol Ann through the television, we now know is a two-way communication street, that the family has been living with this for a while. We've established that they might have a ticking clock in an earlier conversation because poltergeist haunting can just end at any time. This sequence does the hard work of letting us know that while they're inaccessible, in some way they share space. Carol Ann, in the realm she's in, is able to pass through the same space as Diane, so she leaves her scent behind. That seems to be a really direct reference to The Uninvited, which is one of the clear inspirations for this movie. But we also introduced the idea that there is actually an antagonist in this film, which it has not done up to this point. We're about an hour in, and finally we introduce the Beast, which is our demonic character, who we only get glimpses of in this film. And in the sequel, they very smartly made a physical representation of that in the form of Reverend Cain. However, here, the Beast is left to be very amorphous. And I think the Beast itself is what we've been talking about. It's this kind of corrupting influence that modern media and modern entertainment can have on children when they're just too young. There's a good indication of that during the sequence when the Beast makes himself known. The lights flicker in the house and there's a strong wind from both inside and outside the house. The characters are thrown to the floor. Then we get a very quick jump cut to Dana pulling herself off the floor with television static as the entire backdrop to her because she's landed only inches from the television screen. I think it's not so subtly telling us what the Beast really is, and that Beast's roar itself kind of reflects just very loud static as well. Right before that, the scene also gives us some exposition in how they're going to retrieve Carol Ann when the pocket watches and old jewelry fall from the ceiling. It's all pretty elegant because it's wrapped up into this emotional scene between Diane and Carol Ann. And again, who are the central characters in this film? It's those two, and that's why they have this seance communication between the two of them, and it's not any of the other family members that seem to really be able to communicate the way these two can. Notice that Diane is really starting to hone her motherly instincts. She's really starting to understand what it is to be a parent. Now, so is Steve. I mean, the fact that he went out there and found the right professionals to come in, and he's being the more practical one. But practical isn't what's going to solve this problem, because the kids basically need a parent who's there for them emotionally as support. Immediately after they get up off the floor, Marty, one of the parapsychologists, comes running down the stairs saying that he'd gotten bitten by something as he was trying to enter the kid's bedroom. This isn't subtext, but it is a good example of escalating stakes. Earlier in the film, and I didn't call it out, maybe I should have, while the Freelings visit their neighbor to see if there's been any disturbances next door, they're being eaten alive by mosquitoes at a time when the neighbor says he doesn't see any mosquitoes and has probably never even been bit by any. So these small annoying bites are on the Freelings as they're trying to reach out for help. And in this case, the help that they've brought in gets much more serious bites on his midsection. It's not quite like a shark bite out of him, but it's definitely something you'd expect, say, from a very large feral animal. In terms of plot, it's saying, of course, that the beast bit him and then ran downstairs and blew everyone to the floor, and it's like a gust of supernatural wind or energy or something. The escalation is now in place. It's suggesting that the actions are only going to get more violent. It's at this point that really the funny, like Sam Raimi-esque aspects of the haunting, such as the toy of the Incredible Hulk riding the horse that floats through the air, maybe that's done, and maybe we need as an audience to take it more seriously because things are about to get much more serious. We also see a critical moment for the family play out, and it's a very subtle scene. Not that you wouldn't notice it, but it's not portrayed as important as the big special effects scenes that surround it. Steve wants Diane to take the kids and go get a room in town, and she refuses to leave without Carol Ann. Now that is the first absolutely credible bit of parenting we've seen from her. That kind of maternal instinct is not on display before this moment. Again, I'm not saying she doesn't love her kids, but we never got an indication that she would put her life on the line for her kids before. At the same time, Dana, the oldest sister, is adamant that she cannot stay in the house anymore. She needs to go. And so the family's kind of fracturing at the same time they're coming together. And they do the right thing by letting the older daughter go off. And Dana is largely absent for the rest of the film here. She does show up at the very end for really no other reason except to show up at the end so that we can have a family reunion. So as much as I gave the film credit earlier for handling exposition pretty gracefully, this sequence where the entire cast are all just bunking down in the living room with the television on, is filled with way more exposition, and sometimes it reaches the level of like Star Trek technobabble nonsense. But also, it's just a lot being thrown at the viewer all at once to set up the rest of the movie. And I think it's a lot less successful. There's still a lot of emotion, and it carries well. The performances are good. And even the writing is really solid in general throughout this section. But you can't help but feel that you're just being hit with a whole lot of explanation. First, the parapsychologist team come together and they have a talk, putting out hypotheses about what could be happening in the house. They're throwing around a lot of verbiage that sounds very scientific, but isn't. And it all comes down to them saying, well, maybe the ceiling where the watches and the old jewelry fell is where it comes out of. Maybe it's a place we can go in, which, of course, later in the film they're literally going to do. And then Diane, Dr. Lesh, and a little bit later Robbie are talking about what death is and what this whole haunting business is really all about. And they get into a little bit of light theology. But ultimately it comes down to Robbie saying, well, what if I died? Could you tie a rope around me and I could go to the other side and show Caroline how to come back? And this is literally what they're going to do in the movie. And they smuggle it in through this dialogue. But I think it's just a little bit too on the nose. All of this feels a little artless compared to the rest of the movie around it. I don't know that there was a way to do it that wouldn't have felt more clunky, but I also feel that the movie has earned enough credit that maybe if they just had the characters do the things and not talk about them in advance, it would be fine in this case. Exposition scenes like this are still happening, and they're usually not as well written, so it's easy to look at a scene like this and not completely roll your eyes, but I do think a perfect version of this film wouldn't need to do all this. I think we like all this breathlessness. It does add a lot of drama and a lot of tension. But I think you can do that without just kind of saying what you're about to do. It's kind of essay style. Like, first paragraph, tell us what you're going to tell us. Second paragraph, tell us. Third paragraph, tell us what you told us. It's a little too rigid, I think, for a film that is probably about 20 minutes too long. So everyone falls asleep except for Marty, who is charged with watching over the house on the CCTV cameras that the team have set up. Now, look at this shot that I've put on screen here. And if you've been following the logic thus far, it's all coming together real hard now, right? So Marty is watching two televisions, which are both focused on this house, which we know is not a safe program, right? It's definitely a problematic show. And at the same time, he's eating junk food. Remember the junk food that E-Buzz was stealing out of the kids' room in the beginning of the movie? Think about what the effective televisions have been up to this point. But he's restless and hungry. So he goes to the kitchen to see what he can, frankly, steal, much like E-Buzz the dog, to satisfy that hunger. And then what follows is probably the most infamous scene from this film, and one that was quoted a whole lot as one of the reasons that an additional rating was needed in the 1980s. This and Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, all those are Spielberg productions, incidentally. So the interesting thing is this film is very critical of children having access to media that they shouldn't have access to, and it ultimately led to an additional rating that helped prohibit children from blindly walking into that entertainment. So it's interesting that this movie seems to be talking about exactly what the movie eventually facilitated happening. The gore effect that I think everyone remembers is very reminiscent to me of Raiders of the Lost Ark melting faces at the end when the Ark of the Covenant is opened. It's different, of course. This is a man tearing his own face apart. But it also recalls earlier when Stephen kept picking at his mosquito bites. This is taken to a big extreme, of course. A lot of people think this is the Hooper moment of the film, and I really don't. Again, it reminds me of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It really does remind me very much of that Steven Spielberg playful goriness that he used to partake in. I don't know exactly when he gave that up, because it was still in place at least with Jurassic Park. In Jurassic Park, there's that scene with the Velociraptor and the severed arm, which is very, very, very playful, even though it's, for a PG-13 film, fairly gory. The meat moving on its own because it's filled with maggots was always much more disturbing and effective than the actual face tear. The face tear looks like a special effect. The meat moving is, because it's very, very practical and no pun intended, it's really well done. The sound effect especially sells it. It always got me. It seems that the closet light, aka the television light, has taken over the upstairs of the house entirely at this point, because before the spectral woman appears, who comes down the stairs surrounded by orbs of light, you'll notice that the closet light fills the space just like a television illuminating the dark rooms. Also very notable is that when Stephen awakens, the first thing he does is runs, puts himself between the spirit and his wife and son. He wraps his arms around them and he shields them. Just like a moment ago, when Diane was showing her first really strong maternal instincts, here the paternal instincts are coming out in Stephen. Their arc is well underway at this point, their willingness to sacrifice. There's always a chance when you get a guest performer, especially a very charismatic one, in a guest or limited role inside of a film, that they're not just going to steal the scene, but they're going to steal some of the thunder of all that's around them. It's a really great character actor, however, who can still absolutely dominate a scene, but only enhance the proceedings. James Caan here as Mr. Teague is a great example of how to do this right. He's responsible for more exposition, but the way he does it is so wonderfully slimy and relatable, because we've all known people like Mr. Teague. You can't help but love the scene, and at the same time, what's being relayed is pretty awful morally. You know, they're building houses on former graveyards. I'm not a religious or even very sentimental person, really, but that's kind of gross, definitely. The scene very easily could have been a disaster in the way that the earlier exposition scene almost was. But he elevates everything by just presenting his character's interests front and center. Also, I got to tell you, this scene is Satan asking Jesus if he wants to own everything he can see from the hilltop. That's exactly what this scene is. And it's one of the few instances in this film where the Christian reference is used. The film otherwise is pretty careful to be not just non-denominational, but not even tied to a specific religion. There's a lot of woo, just general woo. But here, Steven is given an opportunity to be a full partner in a company. They mentioned millions of dollars being earned, and part of that would be his. He'd get this beautiful new house with an amazing view. And all he has to do is, agree to sign on the dotted line. It's a Faustian offer, but definitely the images that are portrayed are taken straight out of the biblical story. Of course, what kind of an example would that set for his children if Stephen did sign up? And I think that having such an obvious religious reference actually helps introduce Tangina, because this is a character who doesn't have any veneer of science to her. It is pure spirituality from her. And the moment she steps onto the stage, she kind of runs this show. You can pretty much forget about Mrs. Leash or anyone else. This is now the Tangina Barons show. I think it's an iconic character and an amazing performance, really. It's not the kind of performance that you'd put up against like a De Niro in Taxi Driver kind of thing. It's not full of brooding intensity. It is a very playful performance, maybe even cartoonish, but it's smart. And that's the thing that I don't think people give Zelda Rubinstein nearly enough credit for. There's a gentle balance to playing a character like this that believes in patentedly untrue things. If you make the character too extreme, then people just laugh at the character. But if you give the character too much gravitas, then they tend to feel really pompous and false. Because again, they believe in things and they're presenting things that the viewer in their normal life doesn't believe they're really real anyway. So I think this performance is actually one of the best in horror's history, even though I don't particularly like the character. Tangina Barons, it's worth noting, is not good at her job. She figures out what they should do, but does it incredibly poorly. It succeeds despite her. In fact, it succeeds because of Diane. And then she declares that everything's kosher at the end of it, which it's not. Somehow this became a linchpin character for the franchise going forward, but I would never have rehired her. That said, I think the performance is amazing. I think the writing of this character is pretty damn good. I just am not a fan of the character itself. I'm not going to go cut by cut through the entire jailbreak of Carol Ann from the other side, but I do want to point out Stephen's role. Tangina charges him with making Carol Ann answer. His first response is to kind of nicely ask her to. And Tangina says, make her answer you. Get cross. Get angry. Tell her you're going to give her a spanking. And he responds, I've never spanked my children. The difference of 40 years really does make a difference here. There's definitely an idea in the early 80s that if you didn't spank your kids when they misbehaved, you were not parenting properly. Now today, that's kind of thought of the opposite way, right? Whereas any hand on a child is considered abuse. But the fact that Carol Ann has never faced discipline from the family, let alone is probably not used to that being even scolded, kind of tells you how they've been absentee parents. And while it's not my job to either defend or attack the idea whether spanking is abuse or not, I'm not a parent. I don't know, whatever. You figure that out if you need to figure that out. I think in the context of the film, Carol Ann does answer when her father takes a stern parental approach. And that insinuates that at least that level of attention, that intensity of attention, is something the child has always needed but did not get. Now, textually, all the bad influences are coming through the television set and informing their daughter, who starts to act out like their older two children have been acting out, and they haven't put their kids in place. It's at this moment that they can save Carol Ann, because Diane is willing to sacrifice herself, literally, to enter the underworld to retrieve her daughter, which we're going to get to in a second. And Stephen is willing to show his authority in the situation and not let the child make its own decisions in something this important. This film about America having corrupting influences on the nuclear family, on the act of parenting, is really coming to a crescendo here. However, it's a false crescendo, and there's more to this movie beyond the parents simply taking responsibility. Its third act actually has something a little bit different than you might expect, given what's come before.
Diane throws herself into the closet light and into the other side to rescue her daughter. A second surface narrative is present here that the filmmakers anticipate the audience recognizing. This technique is called mirroring or dark mirroring, and it's when the audience is asked to either consciously or unconsciously relate story elements from inside a film or book to a narrative pervasive in our culture. It's similar to the technique known as substitution, except that in substitution, the secondary narrative is referring to something established earlier in that same work. An example of substitution would be the scene in this movie where bulldozers unearth a cigar box that Tweety the parakeet was buried in. That later is reflected when the corpses underneath Quest of Rarity rise to the surface of the swimming pool to accost Diane. In this case, the mirroring technique leverages Greek mythology that it assumes the viewer will be at least passingly familiar with to give a sense of verisimilitude, that is, a sense of familiarity, of sincerity, and importance to the scene. The myth in particular is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. If it's been a while since you were 12 years old and fascinated by this stuff, Orpheus loved his wife so much that when she died, he traveled to the underworld to bargain for her return. Now that story ends in a second tragedy, which is important here, because although Diane succeeds in rescuing Carol Ann, and it seems like a very happy, triumphant moment, it comes with a really horrific price. What many viewers seem to miss is that until now, the Beast and the Lost Souls have been limited in how they can interact inside the house. They're trapped by a membrane that prevents them from just openly invading the space. Once Diane and Carol Ann come back through the living room ceiling, that doorway is left open, and the Beast and company are free to travel through. Remember when I said that Tangina is shit at her job?
This house is clean?
Yeah, that's not going on the resume. Also, take a look at the screenshot for a second. This couple kissing. Beginning of this film, we were looking at a couple that were sleeping separately. One falling asleep on a rocking chair in the living room and the other in bed alone. As she's entering the light, Diane looks back at Stephen and says, "Don't let go." And he says, "Never." Alright, so the arc of the characters has been that they've allowed their family to lose sight of what's really important, which is that they have each other, that they have shared values, and that they're not going to let the outside world pollute that pure family unit. This is the moment where they're all affirming to each other that they've learned their lesson. Diane is willing to sacrifice herself, literally to go into death to save her daughter. And here Stephen is taking the very traditional fatherly role. He's going to be the one that holds the rope. He's the one who's going to pull them through. He's the muscle, whereas Diane is the heart. I know that time hasn't been kind to these gender-specific roles, but there is something beautiful about their relationship in the context of the time in which it was written and filmed. The moving van scene has a couple things that are worth pointing out. The first is pretty obvious, actually. Dana, the older sister, is now back with the family, but when she's told by her mom that the family is going to stay that night at the Holiday Inn on I-74, she mumbles to herself, "Oh, I remember that place." And Diane very briefly goes, "What?" It's just a little bit of reinforcement that the older daughter is not a virginal figure and didn't have the parenting that Carol Ann now will have. The second thing is more of a contrast thing, and it's not as subliminal as like a single image on screen, but it's something that unless you notice, you're only going to process in the background of your head, which is how Diane is now dressing. She now dresses very much like you'd expect a mother to dress, whereas earlier in the film she dressed a lot more like a younger person, even younger than Dana dresses, actually. Now again, please keep your 1982 glasses on here. But the question is, although the Freelings, Steve and Diane, have discovered the value of their family, Are they actually up to walking the walk? When Dana asks her mother, are you going to do anything about the gray that has spontaneously appeared in her hair after her voyage to the other side, she says, oh, don't you think it's cool? Don't you think it's punk rock? That sounds something more like a friend would say than a mother. And sure enough, the next thing we see is her walking into the bathroom, about to take a bath and dye her hair. And Steve isn't without guilt here either. He has to go to the office to just pick up a few things and he'll be back before dinner. After what your family's been through? Really? See how quickly they seek back into not perfect behavior, even though their hearts are now in it. They haven't really learned how to be parents. One is still trying to hang on to her youth and beauty, even when it could negatively affect her family, and the other is still worried about a job that literally put him in a house over corpses that haunted and almost destroyed his family. So the film is about to get pretty meta. Now that they've been to the other side and they understand, they have a higher price to pay. Because now the inside of that house is going to become exactly the sort of sex and violence show that they should have been shielding their children from. Not coincidentally, first thing that Diane does is strip naked and get in the tub. So Robbie and Carol Ann are now tucking themselves in, which, by the way, is another thing that Diane should be doing, especially after what this family's been through. There's a couple things to note here. A, the closet door is closed. Carol Ann is no longer asking for closet light. She's not afraid, going to be seduced by all the noise. Robbie, however, is still in kind of a bad place. In fact, Robbie's in a worse place, because this time when he throws the Chewbacca jacket, he can't cover the clown doll. So on one hand, Carol Ann is no longer afraid of the dark because she no longer has those images being beamed into her head by the television. But you'll notice that Darth Vader is still on Robbie's headboard. And just like that, we're in full exploitation horror mode. The film up to now could probably be classified as a domestic drama with supernatural elements, but right now, the film tips in its third act into full-blown horror exploitation, something that belongs more properly to those freewheeling 1970s. So the clown doll attacks Robbie just as he feared it would. You can see the expression on the clown doll is now a kind of extremely evil grin, something that's so over the top compared to everything else in the movie, which is fairly subtle with its uncanniness, is now something that would make Chucky blush. And Diane, who just fell prey to her own vanity, is fighting off a ghost assault on her bed. Now, as I've referenced before, this was originally meant to be something far different and far more extreme. I'm of two minds here. On one hand, I think it would have made the film a more complete experience if the exploitation grindhouse elements at the end of the film had been allowed to go at least into R-rated territory. But this film is a great gateway for kids to get into horror because the themes, although serious and adult in some ways, still work for kids in the same way that you would hand a young girl a baby doll. You don't actually expect her to parent, but she can mimic the parenting. The message can still get through in this film to kids, and then all the just, regular surface haunting stuff will definitely affect them positively, but it's a fairly safe movie. This isn't a slasher film with a high body count, a lot of nudity and violence, but it almost was, is the point. The third act of this film wants to go there. It wants to go full bore. It wants to show you just how extreme the stuff that the kids have seen on that television set coming in through their cable system has been. Ultimately, a commercial pressure made this a PG film, and we got the film we got. It's still a film that pushes the boundary of PG. It helped create the PG-13 rating, but there was an opportunity for this to be even more. By the time we get to the dead rising from their unmarked graves, it should be very apparent that we're flickering through television channels for every horror that you can imagine. Zero coincidence that the closet door opens and the closet light, that is the television light, invades the children's room again. Diane is pulled out of the swimming pool with the corpses by the neighbors, and the mother who lives next door immediately hears Carol Ann and Robbie screaming and turns towards it and says, "Your children." And that's when Diane, now perfectly clear about her mission, says, "I've got to get them." But look at the shot. Does this not look like people looking up at a movie screen? Because that's what it looks like to me.
The closet light, the television light, the movie is pretty obviously in this shot a movie screen. If you saw Poltergeist in a movie theater, you would be yourself in a similar position to the people on screen. I guess I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions looking at this still, what you see. But there is a certain sexual component to what you're seeing. It also, let's be honest, it also just looks like a bad movie set, which I think is very intentional. I think the idea is that this is the sort of crap that kids have been consuming writ large and about to consume them entirely. So when the mom and then ultimately dad get there to pull their kids to safety, they're really saving them from the culmination of all of the violence and sex that they've seen. And if you can't see it in this still, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe Freud isn't for you. As coffins are rising from the ground around them, Stephen confronts his boss and tells him, "You only moved the headstones, didn't you, you son of a bitch?" And it's a big Capra-esque moment, but it's very much film language, because at that moment, no one would care about confronting their boss. The family all load up into the car. Even the oldest daughter, Dana, has been dropped off by her date. Questa Verde becomes an Irwin Allen disaster film. And then something amazing happens after the family pull away. The house, with lights glowing from every window like little television sets, because the entire house is a television set, implodes. Now, if you are younger and don't remember cathode ray tubes very well, you might not remember what they look like when they shut off. But they kind of look like this. And that is precisely what the house does, just in slow motion. That's not a coincidence. This film about media and childhood and parenting and an America filled with distractions ends with a television set being turned off. Wait, did I say the movie ends there? Because there is one last scene and one last thing the Freelings need to do when they get to that Holiday Inn. They need to roll the television out. It's a perfect image to end the film. We know that the journey of Diane and Stephen is now complete, and they'll be sure to protect their children against the worst influences in our society. As I've said, I don't think Poltergeist is a perfect film, nor is it one that I hold in my top 10, 15, 25, 50, 100, probably 250 films in the genre. But it deserves special attention because this is the last film that had a sense of the old Hollywood respect for an ideal. After this point, and even frankly slightly before this film with films like Evil Dead, there wasn't a concern about the impact of entertainment. And to be clear, I'm not one of those that thinks that violent entertainment causes real violence. I don't think that at all. But just like you don't really want your parents to act like your friends, you want them to be parents, this film is charming in its old school, traditional view of the haunting story. It has more in common with Shirley Jackson than it does Richard Matheson even. And it's great that we had one last time down that road. There have been great movies about the paranormal in the genre since. The Dark and the Wicked is certainly one of them. But they are a different category, and they don't reflect the great history of supernatural romanticism on screen the same way that Poltergeist does. So it's a very special film, even if it's not particularly one of my favorites. And it's one that did play a large role in my childhood. I was allowed to see it because of its rating at a very young age. And looking back, honestly, this movie probably has more disturbing things to say, if outdated in some ways, than a lot of the films that were prohibited from me, like the slasher films or the bloody revenge films, which, yes, contain all the violence and sexuality, but had very little actual content to them. So Poltergeist, a Tobe Hooper film produced by Steven Spielberg, remains one of the last of what I consider classic era horror. That it came out in 1982 already made it a film at a time. But today, when the landscape's littered with very cynical films that are hard to approach or even invest yourself in, this comes off as remarkably solid. If you haven't seen Poltergeist, check it out. If you've seen it a million times, revisit it maybe with my voice in your head, if that's something you'd want to do. In the meantime, let me know how you feel about this new format for the storytelling autopsies. Is it too much? Did you turn it off? Did you just come back to it a few times, or did you listen to it all the way through? Do you want to see other films explored in this kind of depth? Or would you just prefer the short, sharp, condensed version that I used to do fairly regularly? 2024 is going to be a year where I dig a bit deeper than I have before. But I'm going to need your guidance, your friendship, your respect, and your support. As always, there's links in the description below this video about how you can support the channel. I will never have a Patreon. I will never ask for a super chat on any of the live streams. But there are ways you can support the channel. The biggest way you can, of course, is just spread the word about what we're doing here. Thanks.